All right, I let myself get cut off there. So Brexit going forward, this referendum was held under during the leadership of David Cameron when they had the coalition government, and once the vote happened, he chose to step down, and so from there on, Theresa May of the Conservative Party was leading. It She was gonna do everything she could to make Brexit happen, but to follow the what people chose in the referendum. But she was kind of doing so from a relatively weak position, just didn't have the votes or the backing to just make it happen. And so for a couple of years, you're just in this sort of period where it's kind of like trying to sail a ship when there's no wind. It's frustrating at best, and so you're just not getting anywhere. And that's kind of where they were for just a couple of years. It was just everybody in the UK was frustrated by the fact that they just couldn't make this happen. And so they go on and on with all sorts of negotiations and trying to figure out how they're going to pick apart all these 40 years of entanglements that they had developed with the EU, and agreements and regulations and economic contributions. And it's a real tricky thing. And this is constantly discussed in the British news to the point where people feel like they have to keep up with it to understand it, but they don't want to keep up with it anymore. And some people feel like that's all that anybody can talk about is Brexit. And so they're just frustrated and tired of the process. So one of the challenges, trade versus immigration. So the EU doesn't want Britain to leave. They would prefer that the UK government just say, you know what, we can't make this happen, so we're just not going to make it happen, and leave it at that. Because it's kind of like you have a charity, maybe, and so you get lots of little donations from a number of people, but it's the big donors a lot of times that can keep an organization like that afloat. So if maybe you have 2 or 3 big donors, it's important to keep all of those together to keep the charity running well. And so if one of those big donors chooses to leave, all of a sudden you've got a massive gap in your budget. And then if they leave, then some other people who might not be so happy might think about leaving too. And so it can be a real problem for the organization. That's the way that the EU is looking at it. And so Britain was one of their biggest contributors, along with Germany and a couple of others. But it was going to be a blow to the EU if this actually happened. And so for the EU, they're saying, well, if you want to trade with us and you want trade deals, then you have to accept freedom of movement, which is one of the core tenets of the EU. And Britain is saying, well, that's one of the reasons we voted to get out of the EU, at least the people who were leading this charge. And so that was a bit of a deadlock type of situation. Scotland, for its part, voted to remain in the EU, and there's a lot of calls that are happening during this period for a second Scottish referendum to just go ahead and break Scotland away from the UK so that they could join the EU and be on their merry way. That's happening. Doesn't come to anything, but it does happen. And Ireland is a particularly sticky issue because the freedom of movement within the EU is easy, but if Britain chose to get out of the EU, then it would necessarily have to have more border protection between Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland. And it goes into a very long history of tension and violence between the two sides of Ireland, the Protestant side and the Catholic side. And there was a long period there known as the Troubles, very understated term, but it was a pretty bloody period. And so there used to be physical barriers between the two. And when that ended, they chose to break those down, and it was a big deal for them to do so. And now for physical barriers to go back up, it was kind of like a slap in the face to the people that were there that had gone through all that. And so that was a one of those little issues that just kind of kept coming up as a real problem for getting a deal done. And so during this time, Theresa May comes back to Parliament with a reasonably workable deal, and it gets rejected across the parties. Like, nobody's for this version of Brexit, and they keep extending the deadline for Britain to get all of this done well into late fall 2019, and it's just seems to be an impossible task. And so at this point, well into 2019, there's all sorts of possible outcomes. They could have no deal. They could just leave, which is they called maximum Brexit or something along those lines, where they just leave and, we're not looking to get trade deals. Maybe we'll come back later and negotiate, but right now we're just out. See ya. Bye. There were, the various deals that Theresa May come along and developed, but it maybe involved too many compromises, so nobody was happy. They wanted to, possibly they would keep negotiating with the EU. That was an option. Have a new referendum. Basically, hey, are you really, really, really sure that you want to do this whole Brexit thing? And then hope that the people vote to remain this time. People don't get out the vote as like they did last time. Basically, some of the groups wanted to keep voting until they got the answer that they wanted, kind of thing. Hold a new general election. So maybe we'll get a better mix in Parliament. Maybe the Conservatives will have enough votes to get it passed, or they'll go in the country will go in a different direction and shut it all down. Who knows? Removed the prime minister. So May was serving as the negotiator, but maybe somebody else could get the job done better. That was an option. Or just cancel it altogether and say, you know what, this was just a waste of everybody's time. We can't get it done. We'll just say sorry. We just couldn't make it happen. And so some of this could be seen, and this isn't a direct correlation, but there were some trends internationally too that were kind of going along with the election or the referendum in the UK. As part of a larger movement, you see some nationalist pushes happening. You see it in Germany, and you see it in France and others. And you saw some real strides for groups that, were many of them were anti-EU. Many of them would prefer their countries to be independent once more. And they have a lot of the same concerns: jobs, immigration, EU control. And none of them come to the point where they're going to have a referendum. Maybe it's because they're physically connected to the continent, where the UK is at least slightly removed from the rest of the continent. But none of it comes to anything. The Italians do end up with, at least for a little while, end up with an election where the Nationalist Party is voted in, and they make some moves. But again, it doesn't really come to anything. But it does seem to be part of a larger trend at the time. People generally, and even on both sides of the political divide, seem to feel that they don't really have a lot of control over their lives. And you see, interestingly, some of that same sentiment in the U.S. with the 2016 election. And again, it's not a direct correlation, but there do seem to be some connections, even if it is a little difficult to put your finger on it. Two of the biggest people who had impacts on the 2016 election were Trump and Bernie Sanders. Love them or hate them, they kind of had a big impact. And they both surprisingly kind of had the similar support in a lot of ways. Both Sanders supporters and Trump supporters tend to feel like the system is rigged against them. Their concerns aren't being heard by the establishment because, as we know, that Sanders didn't make it through because the system favored Clinton in many ways, and a lot of that seems to connect to the UK. A lot of people feel like they're not being heard by the UK system, and so that's some of what goes in here to the to this Brexit discussion. One other point that's worth making is that the polls in both this referendum and the election in the U.S. were quite wrong. It's clear now that they weren't sampling correctly. They just didn't register the discontent that would push Trump to win or push the Leave vote over the top in the UK, and a lot of people were just completely shocked by the fact that they didn't realize that this was coming. It's difficult to understand alliances. So, are people voting for party affiliation or gender, ethnicity, faith? Are they voting for something different? And do they just want something different? Trump did significantly better in groups like women and minorities than they expected him to. Are the polls reaching average folk? People, and that's some trouble that they often run into. And so a lot of the people who maybe feel left out are often left out of the polls as well. And so all of the, sort of outside the establishment folks seem to do well in this particular election. And it's also interesting that a lot of people didn't realize personally that this was even a possibility. Like in the UK, a lot of the people that I follow on Twitter and other platforms had, but were very confident that the UK would remain in the EU. And same with the 2016 election. Most commentators you saw were very confident that Clinton would be able to walk away with the election, and they're shocked that they don't. And a lot of that has to do with, and it's not just this, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that in modern society we get into these silos, and we don't we're self-selecting because of who we follow on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. What we allow ourselves to hear doesn't fit with what's accurate for the country is maybe that's the best way to put it. And so it's really interesting to see how this is an example of how modern social media is influencing how we perceive the world, and maybe we don't understand our neighbors like we might otherwise. So anyway, just a few random thoughts on that. I don't expect you to know it by heart, but just to know that there are a few connections out there that make sense. And I think I'll pause there, and then we'll come back real briefly and wrap up this discussion here on Brexit.